This was our first operation inside Russia. But that's not the main reason we conducted it.
Welcome to episode 2 of our Battles for Ukraine series. As a special guest, we have with us the big boss, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, General Oleskandr Syrskyi. It's going to be about the Ukrainian incursion into the Russian Oblast of Kursk, which lasted from August 2024 to spring 25. We will be diving into the details of the planning and execution of this one-of-a-kind operation, about why Ukraine was able to capture but unable to hold on to this territory. In that context, we will speak about the actual battle, what happened, on what flank and when, touching the involvement of North Korean soldiers, Western-delivered equipment and long-range weapons, difficult strategic conditions, and the appearance of fiber-optic drones. But first, the beginning.
At the beginning of March 2024, intelligence started to indicate that the enemy was preparing a new offensive operation. It was known that the enemy would attack in the Kharkiv direction. And by the end of April, they had built up a grouping of about 46,000 personnel in the Belgorod area and about 23,000 in the Sumy direction. I made a decision, approved by the President of Ukraine, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, based on the likelihood that the enemy would launch offensives in the Kharkiv and Sumy directions. So we, in order to preempt the enemy's actions, deployed our troops directly to the border, from Vovchansk to the Sumy direction. The enemy hadn't finished preparing its forces. When they saw our units advancing to the border, the Russian military leadership decided to launch their offensive in Kharkiv with whatever forces they had. The offensive began on May 10th. In the border battles, the enemy became bogged down, took losses, and began gradually shifting troops from the Sumy direction. The situation at the beginning of June was very difficult for our troops. The enemy attacked along 12 operational directions, starting from Kharkiv, moving through Toretsk, near Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Pokrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kupiansk, Liman, essentially across the whole front line. The fighting was intense. The enemy had a numerical advantage of 5-6 times in key areas. The situation was really hard. Under these conditions, we had to make a decision that could radically change the course of the war and turn things in our favor, derailing the enemy's plans. We conducted a thorough study of the enemy, their groupings, structures, to find weak points in their defense. It turned out that Sumy was the weakest.
On the early morning of August 6th, the operation begins. The 80th Air Assault Brigade breaches the main border checkpoint here. Under relentless bombardment, the Russian garrison guarding the border quickly surrenders.
Crossing the state border was the first major obstacle. The Russians had created a fortified line. Trenches, mines, dragon's teeth, and other obstacles, stretching in multiple layers. There were reinforced bunkers for infantry, entire fortified zones with concrete shelters where troops were stationed underground and fully equipped for prolonged defense. This border fortification caused delays, but our assault units bravely breached the defenses under fire and created passages for the main forces.
At that time, I was the commander of a strike drone company in the 82nd Airborne Assault Brigade. There were tree lines located at high altitudes in those areas. My company took these positions, and from here, we began our operations. At first, we used reconnaissance drones to detect the enemy on the approaches to Korenevo and this road, on the approaches to Malaya Loknya. We conducted reconnaissance, mapped it, and reported to our senior commander. We understood where the blockade lines were located, and on command, we began to attack the enemy who was here, on the border.
Further east, below the village of Nikolaevo-Darino, there is a second breach led by the 225th Assault Battalion. They are followed by the 22nd Mechanized, who first remain and help control the sector before pushing east towards Sudzha, and also the 82nd Air Assault Brigade using Western-delivered Striker APCs. They continue to lead the push forwards north towards Zeleny Shlach, breaching the main Russian line of defense.
Crossing the border was extremely stressful for everyone, without exception, especially for us, as commanders. We only breathed a sigh of relief right here, once we had crossed it. By the second or third day, as we began moving deeper into enemy territory, we saw that things were going well for us.
The third breach is led by the 116th Mechanized Brigade south of Oleshnya, which is around here. They encircle the village before meeting the 80th Air Assault Brigade in this area to form a joint sector of control. From here, the 22nd Mechanized in the north pushes forward, entering Kazacha Lokhnya, which is here, and then taking control of the main road in and out of Sudzha. A bit further south, the 80th Air Assault passes the most important Russian fortifications and enters the city of Sudzha from the west. Due to the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhgorod pipeline, the city is important on a political level as well. On a military level, it becomes the main operational base for Ukrainian troops operating in Kursk.
The first key town we took was Sudzha. A separate brigade was assigned to it. Other units advanced deep, avoiding engagements where possible, bypassing the enemy. This left the enemy behind our lines and forced them to retreat.
After Sudzha, Ukrainian forces raced to capture as much territory as possible. In the west, the 103rd Territorial Defense Forces Brigade reaches the outskirts of Snagost, which is here. On the main roads, the 82nd reaches the outskirts of Korenovo, which is here. The 80th Air Assault Brigade advances as far as Bolshoye Soldatsko, here, but then has to retreat back on August 8th to Martinovka. But keep in mind that controlling a road does not necessarily mean controlling an entire territory. On the Russian side, at this point, there is a lot of panic and misinformation. It's evident by the many prisoners of war Ukraine is able to take. Also by the fact that 2 Russian Ka-52 helicopters destroyed 2 Russian tanks heading as reinforcements to the border area. But of course, it's only a question of time until Russian leadership starts to understand the dimension of the incursion and begins to react accordingly. The next weeks are characterized by heavy fighting. Ukrainian troops managed to strike Russian reinforcements and hinder their deployment, such as the destruction of a column near Rilsk, which is all the way up here, with US-delivered HIMARS. Moscow redeploys troops, both reserves and from Donbass, and also strikes Ukrainian troops in the rear, like this attack on an M142 HIMARS system in Sumy region with an Iskander ballistic missile on August 17th.
The main goal of the offensive was to decisively strike the enemy defending the border, penetrate deep into their territory, destroy their reserves, and inflict losses. This would allow us to seize the initiative, force them to halt offensives elsewhere, and give us time to stabilize the front. The operation began on the 6th. In just 3 weeks, we captured almost 1,300 square kilometers. The enemy retreated along the entire front. To stabilize the situation, they moved troops from other areas, except Pokrovsk, which remained active. The enemy concentrated about 70,000 personnel in the Kursk direction, including their best airborne forces, Marines, special operations, and elite mechanized units. That's how we disrupted their 2024 summer campaign, prevented our forces from being overwhelmed, and forced the enemy to abandon their plans and adjust strategy.
So how was it possible that the Russian army, especially in a time of satellite and drone surveillance, was so overwhelmed? The answer lies in the Ukrainian preparation, which contained many elements, the most central being Operation Seneka, a covert operation, which, for example, entailed the creation of a fictitious new Ukrainian brigade, the 88th Mechanized, designated to train in the Sumy area. It was a move designed to conceal all troop movements, practice, and preparation for the operation.
The preparation lasted 2 months. Every major military operation includes special missions. I can't go into all the details, maybe after the war, but we carried out a comprehensive set of deception measures to mislead the enemy, hide our actions, divert attention from our main direction, and simulate troop movements, especially when relocating units. We also carried out special actions on territory held by the enemy.
Before the incursion into Kursk, small groups of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, as well as the SBU's elite Alpha unit, had crossed over into Russia. Their mission, scouting territory and demining pathways. While these preparations were underway, General Syrskyi and his commanders were tasked with amassing the thousands of men needed for such an operation.
First, the biggest challenge was assembling the offensive grouping in secrecy. We had to do this without being detected by drones or satellite surveillance. All units stayed far from Sumy until just 10 days before the operation. They were hidden in forested areas using terrain features like ravines and dense tree cover. This allowed us to concentrate forces in secret. Though resistance was fierce, our planning and morale prevailed. Early victories motivated the troops. One goal of this operation was to inspire soldiers with the idea of advancing.
With around 1,300 square kilometers under control, Ukraine was now tasked with defending this territory. And that proved to be a lot more difficult and costly than its capture. For one, Ukrainians had little time to dig and set up proper defenses, as the Russian troops soon begin amassing troops and counterattacking. The second is that the territory in question consists mostly of open fields, with Ukrainian defensive positions anchored either in tree lines or around smaller towns and villages. The largest river, the Sem, here, flows mostly far away from the contested battlefield. On the western flank, the Russian 51st Airborne and the 155th Marine Infantry Brigade lead the counterattack, pushing through to Lubimovka. Russia also attacks on the eastern flank, led by the 810th Marine, Sarmat and Akhmat units in this direction. Ukraine counterattacks with a new breach of the border around Vesele and Medvezhe, led by the 225th, 21st, 95th and Horn. To reinforce their positions in Kursk, Ukraine also sends reinforcements, the 1st and 17th Tank Brigades, as well as the 41st Mechanized. Also, they strike the bridges on the western flank on the River Sem. We are now at September, and Russia, on the other hand, sends in even more reinforcements, for example, the 106th Airborne Division to the western flank. This is the highest concentration of Russian air assault forces since the battle for Kiev. And the dynamic that you see here is really what prevails on the battlefield for the next months. Both sides try to navigate and move troops around, probe each other, defend territory, recapture it. The war is bloody and costly. For example, in September, Russian drone swarms around Vesele destroyed 10 CV-90s and 1 Leopard 2. Then, between October 1st and 20th, according to what we can see from open source footage, Russians lose over 50 armored vehicles. On November 7th, Russians launch a large attack from the northern flank, led by the 810th Marine Brigade. Until mid-November, some sources state they lose over 72 pieces of equipment in the entire Kursk region. At this point, the territory controlled by Ukraine is reduced around half, and the situation on the front line now looks something like this. In November, Ukraine's Western allies, led by the USA, decide to allow the use of long-range weapons, including ATACMS and Storm Shadow, to attack targets inside Russia.
Our partners saw how Russia used all kinds of missile weapons against us, including fiber optic controlled drones that our electronic warfare couldn't counter. In the Kursk direction, 50% of all guided bombs were used. Our positions were bombed daily. Russia also regularly attacked Kharkiv and Sumy with S-300 and Iskander missiles, endangering civilians. Eventually, the US government allowed us to use our own long-range weapons, up to 700 kilometers, against military targets in Russia.
The first Storm Shadow strike on a command post near the village of Marino here kills 18 officers. November 25th, ATACMS hit a 92 N6E radar station and 2 S-400 launchers. On December 20th, Ukrainians destroy a command post in Rilsk, which is here, and on December 28th in Lvov, here, and on January 2nd in Ivanovsk. To compensate their losses both on the front line and in the rear, push back the Ukrainian incursion, Russia during this time turns to an old ally, North Korea.
Despite having nearly 70,000 elite troops, the Russians couldn't succeed. So they brought in North Korean troops, 4 brigades, about 12,000 soldiers. They trained in Russian camps for a month, then were sent to the front. They were mostly under 30, highly motivated, ideologically committed, and followed orders unquestioningly, almost robotically. They used Soviet tactics, attacking in platoons or companies, ignoring casualties, fighting to the last man. It was shocking, because the Russian army doesn't fight that way. They suffered heavy losses, over 4,000 dead. One brigade was completely wiped out, and the others were rendered combat ineffective. After that, their active role ended. They were retrained, equipped with Russian gear, and used to reinforce Russian units in subsequent operations.
Indeed, there exists quite a lot of footage from that time that is, to say the least, pretty bananas. For example, the video of a Ukrainian striker IFV hunting over North Koreans in midfield. But their deployment was not at all a joke. Their tactics might have been old school in the beginning, but their high motivation should not be underestimated. On foot, they often managed to bypass the first Ukrainian lines of defense and encounter, for example, drone pilots operating further back. My colleague Mikita interviewed some soldiers who had experienced exactly such a situation. To call their deployment ineffective would be a misconception.
At that time, we had defensive lines in those villages. At one point, groups of 30 to 40 soldiers began running out of the forest. We hadn't seen anything like that in this war for a long time. When we saw that there were 30 or 40 of them, it caught us by surprise at first, and we had to reorganize quickly. The unmanned systems units are quite modern. It was more difficult for our infantry to adapt to such tactics, being on the defensive and realizing that the enemy was attacking from 3 directions. They needed a bit more time to regroup and to organize ammunition and weapons at their positions.
In response, Ukraine deploys extra troops and quite a large number of special operations forces to the northern salient around here. The 73rd Naval Operations Center, the 6th Rangers Regiment, the 8th Special Operations Regiment, for example. Assaults on all 3 flanks, west, north, and east, continue during this time, and it's fair to say that the situation is becoming increasingly difficult for Ukraine. Like in other parts of the front line, continuous attacks paired with relentless strikes on logistics using drones, using the advantageous position of having a lot more resources, is a slow but in some ways successful tactic for Russia. In the beginning of January, they enter Makhnovka, close to Sudzha, as well as achieve gains on the western flank. Ukrainian vehicle losses are high. The 47th Brigade, which was formed originally as a spearhead for the counteroffensive in 2023, in the beginning of 25 loses 3 M1 Abrams and around 20 IFVs. On the Russian side, we see not only soldiers, but also equipment from North Korea appearing, such as the Bullseye 4 ATGM and the M1978 Koksan. One is an anti-tank system, the second is a kind of self-propelled howitzer using a quite unusual 170mm caliber. By the way, I'm very sorry about my pronunciation. If anyone in North Korea is listening to our video, you can tell us how to pronounce it correctly in the comments. At the beginning of February, Ukrainians organize a counterattack in the direction Kolmakov, Cherkaska Konopelka, and Fanasievka, which is around here. The idea to gain more buffer zone around Sudzha and protect the key city under Ukrainian control. They succeed initially, but around February 22nd are pushed back once again. By this time, and from all factors contributing to the Russian success, this really might be the most vital one, the Russians have accumulated almost all of their best drone units in the region. Rubicon, Bobber, the Hateful Eight, Kaskad, and the Pseudo-Platov battalion. And in regard to electronic warfare and the use of fiber optics, they undoubtedly have an advantage. In addition, winter is ending, with muddy roads creating shitty conditions. These drone units don't only strike the roads into Sudzha, but attack far behind the front line on Ukrainian territory here. There are countless videos from the beginning of 2025 that shows the dangerous situations on the roads, both inside Kursk, leading into Russia, as well as in the Sumy region. You must remember, there exist smaller dirt roads crossing the border, but there is only one real, big, concrete road into the Russian region. And once that came into the range of Russian FPVs, well, I guess the footage we are showing you right now underlines how dangerous it was for any Ukrainian soldier to even get to their deployment. Resupply, ammunition, evacuation of wounded, all that became a super difficult task and, well, the result tells the rest of the tale. In March, Russian forces entered Ukrainian territory west of the salient. By March 5th, the Russians crossed the river in Kurilovka. With all the supply roads under heavy pressure, retreat begins, accompanied by the final Russian advance. In addition to pushing from all sides, Russians begin what they call Operation Stream, trying to smuggle their soldiers through the pipeline into the rear of Ukrainian defense. On March 8th, first men appear out of the pipeline next to Sudzha.
Це допомогло російським військам.
It helped Russian troops to some extent, but the pipeline itself didn't play a decisive role. It allowed 2 or 3 enemy companies to land near Sudzha, but the real issue was the massive bombings and fiber optic drones. The entire area beyond Sudzha was under attack and under control. The enemy focused on destroying our logistics capabilities.
By March 16th, the Russians officially capture Sudzha. By April 26th, the entire region is under Russian control, while some forces even enter the Sumy region, although it must be said that border raids by both sides continue to this day. Now, looking back and taking all the factors we know now into account, there are questions worth asking. How would you describe the situation in the Sumy and Kursk border region right now?
Після Курської операції
Due to the use of North Korean ammunition and the creation of a numerical and resource advantage, by the end of the Kursk operation, the number of Russian troops had reached up to 93,000 soldiers. A huge amount of weaponry, equipment, and strike drones was concentrated in this direction. This allowed them to gradually conduct successful offensive actions.
ми не планували взагалі-то.
We did not intend to stay permanently on Russian Federation territory. This operation was temporary, aimed at achieving specific goals.
Оце угруповання
The Russian grouping significantly outnumbered us. To avoid unnecessary losses, we gradually withdrew to the border. We established positions along the border between the Sumy and Kursk regions. Russian forces managed to advance 10-12 kilometers into our territory, but they were stopped. Then we regrouped and launched a counteroffensive, stabilizing the situation.
проводяться
Active efforts are now underway to completely push the enemy out. Russian forces are trying to hold on to the small portion near the border they still occupy and are conducting counteroffensive actions. So we can say the situation has stabilized, though it remains tense.
Maybe we could speak one more time about the reasons for this operation. Why was it important and what did it give Ukraine on a strategic and operational level?
ця операція була
Well, first of all, this operation was truly unique because it was the first to be conducted on the territory of the Russian Federation. But that wasn't the main reason we carried it out. As I have already said, the primary goal of the operation was to eliminate the possibility of Russian offensive operation into Sumy region. That is, for almost a year, the region and its residents were spared the horrors of Russian occupation. For 8 months, Russian forces were striking their own territory, bombing their own settlements. They effectively turned the entire border area of Kursk region into total ruins. The offensive in the Kursk direction also changed the course of the war. It disrupted the enemy's plans and prevented the destruction of our forces in other areas, as the Russians were forced to switch to defense and redeploy troops from other fronts, which significantly weakened them. As I have already mentioned, troops were redeployed from almost all directions except Pokrovsk.
після року
After a year of defensive fighting, we have once again moved to offensive operations,
і ми можемо бити ворога.
and we can strike the enemy. Even though many theorists claim that under modern conditions, offensive actions, especially on such a scale, are impossible. But we have shown that we can,
Можемо навіть
and that even under the dominance of drones, satellites, and aircraft in the sky, we can covertly assemble an offensive force and carry out such an operation.
наступальну операцію.
That's it for this episode of Battles for Ukraine. Thank you for watching our video. Thank you for watching United 24 Media. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, maybe consider donating to the cause, and we wish you a pleasant day or evening.